Today we are looking at women and Reconstruction, and much like the Civil War, this one's going to be broken into two parts, the North and the South, because what's going on in the North during the Reconstruction period is very different than what's going on in the South. I'm going to look at the North first, just because it's shorter on what we're going to focus on with Reconstruction today, and there's more to talk about with the South. So in the North, the issue that comes up at the end of the Civil War has to do, of course, with voting for women. One of the things that had been pushed with the abolition movement was women's rights, and was very much tied to that, for at least in women's eyes. And there was hope. So the thing is there was hope that they would, with the change in amendments with the end of slavery, that women would have those rights attached to it. And that makes sense, because it's hard to get new amendments in the Constitution. And so when there is that kind of fundamental change that is going to create that, that is the kind of the best time to try to make sure it gets added, right? That's why women like Abigail Adams push for that in the Revolutionary War, with a new code of laws being created. And again, we have here, after the Civil War, new amendments like the 13th Amendment ending slavery, and then what's going to become the 14th and 15th Amendment that are going to talk about voting rights. And hoping that then that could be put into it with that, which would be, like I said, it was a reasonable assumption that that would be the time to get it in, than trying to get a whole new amendment just for women's right to vote. And so women were, like I said, really hoping that that was going to be the case. However, the people in Congress who were looking to write the 14th Amendment, there was a belief with radicals in Congress that if they combined women's suffrage and black suffrage together, it would ultimately hurt, if not create significant problems for black suffrage. And there was arguments about that before, how much it was, realistic and truthful versus just an excuse not to include women in that. That could be debated, but there was at least expression of the idea that combining women's suffrage and black suffrage was a bad idea, because it would ultimately hurt black suffrage. And their argument with that was that it would lead to people intentionally limiting black suffrage because they didn't want women to vote, which wasn't a problem in the South. They actively make sure that that doesn't happen, that black suffrage isn't available anyway. Soon after, we'll see, it doesn't take long into Reconstruction for that to happen. So the 14th Amendment, what is significant about how it was written was that they specifically, so the 14th Amendment first, what it was for was granting voting rights to former slaves. And when they wrote it, they intentionally made it apply to male inhabitants. And this was significant, besides the fact that it just said male inhabitants, is the first reference to gender in the U.S. Constitution. So the fact that they use this to be the first time that gender is mentioned was clearly an intentional thing, right? It was not like just an accident or just how it's written in the Constitution. It was very much an intentional aspect to make sure that those two things weren't combined. And this was, a letdown for women's rights movement. They were very disappointed. And this kind of became even more problematic when you had the 15th Amendment that was added specifically to essentially ensure black suffrage and be more specific about how you could not limit those freedoms. And we'll see there is some things when we talk about the South and Reconstruction that they did early on to try to limit black suffrage. And so the 15th Amendment was kind of a reaction to that. So the 15th Amendment basically forbids states from preventing someone from voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And like I said, you'll see the previous condition of servitude was used in various ways to try to prevent black suffrage in the South. So you have these these two amendments, and once again, now this one, gender is not included. And this, because of the amendments that were written, and the fact that women were specifically excluded in one and then not mentioned in the 15th Amendment, because there was, again, a kind of a second wave of hope that would be where they would get in. This really did divide the women's rights movement, because there was the question of whether they should endorse the 15th Amendment. And they were split, because you do have the issue of, well, we want to support black suffrage, but at the same time, we're completely excluded from this. So, how does that work? And prior to this, they had been working with the radical Republicans for abolition, and this caused a break. Well, some people, some of the major players, it caused a break with the radical Republicans. The two main women that were some of the driving forces behind women's rights was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and specifically women's suffrage, and Susan B. Anthony. And so they broke with the radical Republicans and formed their own group. Let me rewrite that. Broke with radical Republicans. Okay, and so they formed their own group, which was the NWSA. And the NWSA stands for National Women's Suffrage Association. And this group was definitely the more radical of the two main groups that developed with for women. They are going to be the ones that are more consistent in pressing for women's rights and suffrage. So they really were the ones that didn't give up, essentially, on trying to find a way to get women the right to vote. They were also more active in speaking circuits, protests, petitions, going through the government and that type of thing. The other group that formed out of this kind of split was the American Woman Suffrage Association. They looked more at, so the other thing with this, right, that this was more at the federal level, and the Women's Suffrage Association was more at the state and local level. They kind of gave up on the federal level having going to be giving the right to vote. And so they focus more on trying to get individual states. So even if nationally women couldn't get the right to vote, individual states could give women the right to vote. And there were already examples of this in Western states who had used it as kind of a lure to get people to move out into those states. And so the hope was, if you already had examples of states who had where women's suffrage existed, they could use that as a model to push in areas where they were most likely to get change, and then kind of work out from there. The thing with that, of course, is that there was this divide and question of just, where do they go from here? If this ultimately, women have tried everything to include women's rights. It seemed like such a strong movement with the abolition movement, and now all of that kind of dissipated in the process. How do you address the situation? So what ends up happening is the NWSA decides to formulate this plan called the New Departure. And the New Departure was based on interpreting the 15th Amendment. So they said, well, we can't change the amendments now. And it's the likelihood that we get a 16th Amendment that is going to be for women's suffrage is very unlikely. So can we work with the 15th Amendment? And the reason the 15th Amendment was because it didn't have gender written into it. So the 14th Amendment was out because it said male suffrage. And that meant that there was no way that they were going to work around that. And so they looked at the exact wording of the 15th Amendment, and it had, they basically broke down the wording. And so one of the things it talks about is persons in who have the right to vote. You cannot be denied, persons cannot be denied the right to vote as citizens based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So they said, well, let's interpret this, right? Women are persons, and I'm not, persons is not in quotations as not really. It persons in terms of the connection to the 15th Amendment, because I guess that could look like just joking, but they're saying no, women are persons as is worded in the 15th Amendment. Therefore, as persons, as it's said, they are citizens of the United States, right? And that was in the first sentence of the 15th Amendment, of that persons as citizens of the United States could not be denied the right to vote based on race, color, and position, previous condition of servitude. Therefore, the right to vote was central and inherent to national citizenship. So based on that, women as persons and citizens of the United States had the right to vote. So this was their new interpretation. This is what they hoped to be able to use in an argument. Now, they hadn't decided fully how they were going to do this, And before they ended up making a plan, you had Victoria Woodhull, who she was an interesting character. She was part of the NWSA and interested in women's rights, and was born into poverty and had made her way up in society and wealth, in part by cultivating friendships and relationships with powerful and wealthy men. And she was friends with a congressman, and so with his help, she ended up presenting the case for the new departure without the knowledge of the women in the NWSA, and to the Judiciary Committee. Of the House of Representatives. And what she had hoped was that she could get them to agree to that interpretation. So that was her goal. However, this got sidetracked because of a scandal that took place. So we'll put scandal sidetracked this goal. We'll say goal, right? So what happened is that she accused Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, Henry Ward Beecher, who was a minister and also the brother of Catherine Beecher Stowe and powerful, of adultery, and said that he had an affair with one of his parishioners. And this was he had powerful friends, and of course, not surprisingly, they took the man's side in this. And so what happened is there was what was called some of the wealthy, influential people connected to him didn't take kindly to this. Also, they didn't like what she had presented to the Judiciary Committee. And so there was what was called the Comstock Act. And the Comstock Act, which was named after Anthony Comstock, was an anti-obscenity law. It did not actually give any type of it wasn't specifically in the law targeted towards women, but not surprisingly, almost everyone who was charged with it were women. So while in the law it didn't say women, it definitely was, the Comstock Act was a target towards women, and they used it in this case to target her to end what her very public push for women's suffrage rights. And so they claimed that because she had sent this letter to newspapers to be distributed, that was against that was fell under the anti-obscenity law. So she ended up being jailed based on this law, specifically for, like I said, using the mail system, the federal mail, to have her accusations published. Right, under this anti-obscenity law. Of course, ignoring the whole point of what Henry Ward Beecher did, and instead focusing on the person who, brought it to light. What happens from this is that the majority of women actually just pretend they don't know her. They were very unhappy that she went ahead without asking them to do this. And so they didn't visit her in prison. They kind of acted like they didn't know her, because they felt like she had ruined everything because of, one, submitting it, and then what they saw is kind of putting herself in this position to be used in this way. No one was really arguing that she deserved it in terms of that, although there was always kind of an air of scandal around her, and rumors about her moral decency, if you will, because that still was a thing of even for women. But it wasn't so much that it was like, oh yeah, she totally went out and did this stupid thing, that she deserved the Comstock Act. Most of the women hated it, the Comstock Act, because they knew it was just to target them. But that she had done it without their knowledge and then gotten herself into a position where this could be used against her. So not so much the act as just what they felt was stupid decisions that then, like, it undermined the new departure. And that's what they argued, is they said that this undermines our entire premise because now it's connected to this scandal and you being arrested. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the only one to visit her and defend her, saying that we should not be abandoning her at this point, that too many women have been the target of this type of attack, and she said the exact quote was, "We have already women enough sacrificed to this sentimental, hypocritical prating about purity. If this present woman be crucified, let men drive the spikes. I can read. And so what she's saying is right, that we've already been crucified with all of this prattle about purity, and women should not be the ones driving the spikes into her. If it's going to be someone, then it should be men, but women shouldn't join in on that." So what happens with this is essentially, she was encouraged to leave. She could avoid jail long term if she left town. And so she did eventually. She moved to England and married someone there, married an Englishman. But what's interesting with this, right, is essentially men use the law to stop her from presenting this new interpretation, that they, at least they were threatened by it enough that they blackmailed her into leaving. And part of the reason was because she did have some incredibly high profile friends in the government that she potentially could have used to push this through. And so they used a law, charged her, and then blackmailed her to have her leave so she couldn't keep, causing trouble. And we'll see that the use of law corrupted again with Susan B. Anthony. So they wait a little bit and kind of try to figure out what they're going to do. They don't stop giving up on this, and they say we still need to push the new departure theory, because it's the only really chance that they're going to maybe get the right to vote at this point in time. So during the elections of 1871 and 1872, women decided to, let me make sure I was on the right one, yeah. Women decided to test the theory, not by going to court, but instead they went to the polling stations and their goal was to try and convince the polling officials to let them register and vote, right? Because at that point, you could go to these polling officials and register right there, and they had the power to decide that whether you could do so. And so this was done so this was attempted in various states. So it was a coordinated effort to push an attempt to do this. Several attempted and failed. You do have those that had various degrees of success. An African-American journalist, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, there's 2 D's. She was in Washington, D.C., and she went to the polling place using the New Departure as her argument, and she was able to register but not vote. So they said, well, we'll let you register to vote, but we're not going to actually let you vote. So I don't know if that was the polling officials' attempt at a compromise, or like, well, this will get her out of here. But so she was allowed to register to vote, and several people weren't allowed to do either. And then Susan B. Anthony in New York was allowed to register, and she was allowed to vote. And so she initially wrote and shared her experience and hailed it as a success. That, look, the New Departure worked. And yay, this is a positive step forward. 2 weeks later, after she announced that she was able to do this, she was arrested. And she was arrested under a Confederate law, not a Confederate law, under a law for Confederate officers, which, of course, she was never a Confederate soldier or an officer. So arrested under Reconstruction law. And this law was set up when they were first working on Reconstruction. So this was in the very, very early days of after the Civil War, that when they wanted to have a plan for how to get the states back into the Union. And so they had these conditions that the states had to meet. And there were different rules about officers and the Confederate. So the average Confederate soldier was not penalized, but Confederate officers were, plantation elite were all disenfranchised. And they had to ask for essentially a presidential pardon to be able to come back to vote. And then that wasn't supposed to be given until certain conditions were met to prove that the states weren't going to disobey the 14th and later the 15th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment. It really was about, you can't keep slaves, you have to follow the Union rules, you have to address fealty and loyalty back to the United States, so on and so on. So that's what this law was about. So it was a sham from the beginning, because she obviously was never a Confederate. She was never she wasn't in the Southerner fighting for Confederate rights. She wasn't a Confederate officer. But this is what they arrested her on. So once again, men used the law to punish women for trying to get the right to vote. First with Victoria Woodhull, and then with Susan B. Anthony. Her trial was a sham as well. What we'll say is it was a joke, and it was essentially, it had to have been illegal what the judge did. So during the trial, the judge ordered the jury to find her guilty. which even back then, that had to be illegal to find her guilty. Then, after they came back with what the judge told them to do, he gave the final verdict, and he refused the punishment. He gave her no punishment. So he found her. So she was found guilty, obviously because the judge ordered the jury to do so, but there was no punishment or jail time. And the reason to do this by the judge, why the judge did that, was so that she could not appeal her verdict, right? Because I don't know how, again, I don't know the whole court system now, and whether if you were found guilty but there was nothing happened, you've got to be able to appeal the conviction, because that could still be on your record. But back then, if there wasn't, even if you were found guilty of something but there was no punishment, no jail, no fine, no nothing, then there was nothing to appeal. So he did it intentionally to make a point that you were guilty. If women tried to vote, he used Susan B. Anthony as an example. If women try to vote, we will charge you. And then we're not going to put you in jail, because that way you can't take it to a higher court and appeal and then maybe win your case. And so it was essentially that they're going to, through kind of terror, through judicial terror, try to stop women from pressing with the right to vote. And then the last thing, and this was probably the most devastating of all of these events, and really you have a kind of a slowdown of women pushing for things, because a lot was going on during this time period of women pushing and pushing and pushing for suffrage and trying to get it in there at some point. After Minor v Happersett, it was such a big blow that they didn't stop, but it kind of deflated the movement in some ways. So I do want to make it clear, women didn't stop fighting for the right to vote, but that what was seen as kind of this momentous push at the time did die down after this period. So Minor v Happersett was a case that the Supreme Court heard. Supreme Court case, and it was specifically the woman's name was Virginia Minor, and she sued the polling official who refused to allow her to vote. And it got taken up to the Supreme Court. So what was so significant about this was the decision. The decision by the Supreme Court came down, and their conclusion, she lost. They ruled it was unanimous. So a unanimous decision, which was also more devastating, right? If you had some of the Supreme Court judges dissent, that might have given some opening, but it was unanimous. And what they said is Minor was a citizen, but just because she was a citizen, but just being a citizen doesn't give you the right to vote. So they're saying it wasn't an innate right of citizens to be able to vote. Then they went further than that. That was bad enough. If they had just said that alone would have been devastating. But then they went further, and so that made it even worse. Is that they said voting? Moved up as I was writing. Voting was a privilege. So not only was it not right, it was a privilege bestowed by the federal government as it saw fit. So what's significant about this is that essentially it undermined not only women's suffrage, but black suffrage as well. So this ends up being a devastating blow to both, because it narrows the definition of the 14th and 15th Amendment, but also allows for discrimination in certain ways that the South is going to use for black suffrage, because now they can say, well, it's not a right, so it's a privilege, so therefore we can create certain conditions of what it takes for your character to have the right to vote. And this is going to see when we talk about the segregated South, one of the things that comes out of this is voting tests, and essentially saying you have to pass a test to have the privilege to vote, to show that you're worthy of voting. And of course, while they technically had to be the same, they couldn't apply different testing. They couldn't apply testing just to the black population, and they weren't supposed to provide different testing to white or black voters, but they do. So they still ended up providing this test to everyone in the South that wanted to register to vote. But of course, it just happened miraculously every time to give black voters that were interested in voting a much harder test than white voters. And that only became allowed because of the Supreme Court's decision here. So what they had hoped with the Supreme Court would be a final push to prove that women as citizens had the right to vote, became an incredibly devastating decision. And so after this, of course, the shift began. The realization of this with Minor V Happersett is that they were never going to get the interpretation for women's suffrage. And so then they began to have the shift to getting a new amendment. But as I mentioned, this, it doesn't happen until 1920. Women don't stop pushing for this, but what you see in the movement definitely takes a long time, right? But takes until 1920 with the 19th Amendment to happen. So we are on the 15th right now. We have several amendments that pass before women's right to vote happens. Okay, the second thing, and the only other thing I want to talk about with women in the North during what was the Reconstruction period is education. So put that there. As I mentioned before, prior to the Civil War, prior to, actually, we should be more specific because there was something right before the Civil War. Prior to the Seneca Falls Convention, right, women were not allowed to, there were no colleges that admitted women, which is why they had put that in their Declaration of Sentiments, that women were barred from higher education. Just before the Civil War, right, that changed, and Oberlin College allowed women to attend. But of course, this was with a caveat that it was for women's, or what they called ladies' courses. And these ladies' courses were very limited as far as connected to that domestic sphere. So, that was looking at cleaning, cooking, manners, things like that. And On top of that, it was very much connected to the idea that it wasn't, they admitted women to improve education for men, right? It wasn't about admitting women for their own education and the belief that women should be educated equally or anything like that. There was what they basically said is that they needed to, the tone and quality of campus culture was lacking a feminine touch. And if women were part of that, the men would behave better. And what they called like that the customs, vulgar customs that of a so frequently depraved all-male college. Now, this did have very little impact on other schools until 1862. So not a lot of people. Now, Oberlin College will change and eventually open up into further coeducation, but that the earliest, right, this was in around the 1830s that Oberlin College initially started this ladies' course, and other campuses didn't really follow. But then you're going to have the Moral Act, not Morehill, in 1862. And this is Congress is going to provide funding for higher education. And this is going to then start to open up other opportunities. Funds. For higher education and public education. We'll still keep it as higher education. This was looking at providing, one of the things it did was the Moral Act is provide land grants for colleges as if women were included in that process. Now the land grant, the actual language of the land grants did not actually specifically say women. It didn't mention women. But what happens is that taxpayers not only demanded their daughters to be educated, but assumed that it included them in some cases. And so what happens with this when the Moral Act happened, that they demanded their daughters be educated and assumed it included them. And so in order, based on that support and wanting to keep that, they realized they were going to need to include women within this land grant based on the Moral Act. And so what happens is they decided it was cheaper to provide co-education rather than build separate colleges and education facilities for women. And so this is the start of co-education, even though technically Oberlin College was the first. This was really more the push and change that took place with it. We'll say facilities for women. And so you start to have other schools that begin to open up their doors for women. And it starts off much like Oberlin's, with offering limited courses for women. So what they did is that in order to get the moral grant and taxpayers not getting upset about that, opened up colleges already in existence to women, but with, we'll say, limited or in specific courses available. So they were not able, in a lot of cases initially, to take all of the courses available, or all of the degrees available for men. And this, of course, this was seen by some as at least a first step. What it also did was, and the elite colleges, by the way, didn't include women that were private, right? So this was for public schools. Elite schools still excluded women. And this immediately brought on a debate, though, about whether there should be coeducation. One of the things that was brought up was, of course, this fear of, talking and writing here, this fear of a highly sexualized atmosphere, like that they were going to have unsupervised mixing of the sexes, and so that the unsupervised interactions, which could lead to, right, a sexual atmosphere. Others just used it based on the argument of a lack of full education for women, where others argued that the benefit of women being educated with men was that it gave them access to male teachers and ideas that were otherwise not available to them. So there was both support for and against coeducation, as well as, I guess, an argument that it just didn't do enough. To classes, ideas, and education normally not available. From this, you have the first all-women's college that kind of rose up in response to coeducation. But the first all-women's college was Vassar College. And Vassar College opened, and it was an all-female school. And they specifically said that they would admit women through the front door, not the side door. And what they meant by this is that, it would be, they weren't hiding women and only giving them part of school, that they would also provide a full education and opportunities for women. So no limiting of classes or degrees because they were a woman. And also the idea of that being around other women and not being a minority would be beneficial to women, as they would be treated equally. And then they argued that, right, that because women were in a small minority in the coeducation field, that they were often overlooked or ignored in that process. And so what they decided that they were going to do was, well, one of the other benefits is that this allowed women to teach college, which was otherwise not available to them, and also be administrators of the college, including the president. So it opened up job opportunities for women in the process as well. But basically, they wanted to prove, they saw themselves as an experiment in the early years, and their goal was to prove that women were as capable as men in undertaking an education that was just as equal to elite colleges, right? Because one of the arguments of why they had limited classes was an argument that women were not physically capable of the strenuous education that men took. As undertaking a college education as difficult as men and elite colleges. So they wanted to prove, but they also then had to show that this didn't harm women. Because what started to go about with, as women began to be in coeducation, was that higher education was ruining women's health. There was a doctor, Dr. Edward Clark, and he was a prominent doctor that made the argument and position that college education was harming women and permanently stopping their period, which, you know, besides the health part of it, was seen as horrible because this meant they could not be mothers, which was the whole identity of and purpose of women to many people still. And this got parents worried as well, and others that began to question, like, was college education destroying women's femininity? So let's look at the reading. I'll put it here too. Miss D and Miss E, because this was the argument of argued college was bad for women's health. So let's look at what the argument was with that. Okay, so I added this in. This is one of the documents, and I know it's a little confusing because I just have the copy of the part that I wanted us to look at, and of course it has my writing on it. So this part here, this part. So if you're going to go back to it and you haven't looked at it, right, we can just cut that out, and then this is not part of it too. So it's just this section on Miss D and Miss E. Okay, but we're gonna take a look at it here. He was a prominent doctor, and he started publishing what he claimed were his findings on these women that were sent to him that had been going to college, and these were the conditions that he observed. And so this is why college education was dangerous for women's health, and really argued of this was, to show why women should not, or why women could not handle college, could not physically handle college. And we'll add a few more things on it after we talk about it. Okay, so what you have, and I tried to make it big enough so it was clear to read. Miss D went to college in good physical condition. So this is key right here, right? He started off by saying, right, she was fine when she started college. During the 4 years of her college life, her parents and the college faculty required her to get what is popularly called an education, which is kind of a funny name for it, popularly called an education, as opposed to what? Who knows? Nature required her during the same period to build and put in working order a large and complicated reproductive mechanism. So his wording for stuff in here is really funny. What is this saying right here? Nature required her during this same part to do this. This is referring to her period. Basically, that, and remember that people went to college earlier than we do now. And I think it says does it say how old they were? Maybe not in this part, but they were, you could go to college at 14 to 16. Okay. So, that was normal from this time period. So this nature required her during the same period to build and put a working order a large and complicated reproductive mechanism. Basically, she was going through puberty and starting her period. A matter that is popularly ignored, shoved out of sight like a disgrace. She naturally obeyed the requirements of the faculty, which she could see, rather than the requirements of the mechanism within her that she could not see. Subjected to the college regimen, she worked 4 years in getting a liberal education. Her way of work was sustained and continuous, and out of harmony with the rigorous or rhythmical periodicity of the female organization. So what he's saying here is that her work in college, by being in college, that it forced her, it was out of harmony with, again, her female organization with her period. So that education and a woman's cycle do not work together. Right? That's what he's claiming, that continuous work. The stream of vital and constructive force evolved within her was turned steadily to the brain and away from the ovaries. So what he's specifically saying here, let's keep the numbers with it, 3, 4. What he's saying here is that there's two choices, or there's one choice. Oh, two choices, I guess. One option for you have to pick one or the other. Two choices. You can either have this force go to your brain or to your reproductive organs, right? It's not both. And because she was focusing on her education, she chose her brain over her reproductive system, as if somehow you control that in some way. The result of this sort of education was that these last mentioned organs, deprived of sufficient opportunity for nutriment, and first began to perform their functions with pain, a warning or of error that was unheeded, then to cease to grow. Next, to step up once a month, a grumbling torture which made life miserable, and lastly, the brain and the whole nervous system, disturbed in obedience to the law that if one member suffers, all members suffer, became neurologic and hysterical, which is definitely, this is a word used for women. Women get hysterical. And that what's interesting with this is, here, we're going to put it here because there's more to it. The word hysterical was always connected to women. And because it was only something that women did, it was also connected to reproductive organs. And in fact, some doctors, what would happen with this is that this word was used to commit women to asylums, where husbands would put their wives in asylums if you were too loud, if you disagreed too much, if you were too emotional. These things could all be then comprised under hysterical. The other thing they did is that they actually had surgery where they removed women's uterus, believing that the uterus was the cause of this problem, right? So they actually did surgeries on women for being hysterical in the mid to late 1800s, and often not by choice, or committed women to asylums, which in this case we see that this happens. So that word hysterical is significant because, like I said, it's only used for women. But what he's saying, right, is that the other thing he's saying is, while you only have a choice to focus on the brain or reproductive organs, if reproductive cycle period fails, right, then eventually the brain goes. Basically, you become hysterical or crazy if you don't get your period. If you deprive those organs and then it cycled, then you're going to become crazy. That's what he's saying with that. Her parents marveled at her ill health, and she furnished another text for the often repeated sermon on the delicacy of American girls. And then he gives another case. Miss E had a hereditary right to a good brain and to the best cultivation. Her father was one of our ripest and broadest American scholars, and her mother one of our most accomplished American women. They both enjoyed excellent health. Their daughter had a literary training and intellectual, moral, and aesthetic half of education, such as their supervision would be likely to give, and one that few young men of her age received. Her health did not seem to suffer at first, but she studied, recited, walked, worked, stood, and the like in the steady and sustained way that is normal to the male organization. So that this idea of it's normal to the male organization, essentially he's arguing that women acting like men is bad for women's health. Right? That women can't compete with men and do the same things as men because their the male organization, the women's organization, right? He calls it organization, or body or whatever, can't hold up to the male body, and yet she's doing all these things in college that men would do. And she seemed to evolve force enough to acquire a number of languages, become familiar with the natural sciences, take hold of philosophy and mathematics, and to keep in good physical case while doing all of this. At the age of 21, she might have been presented to the public on commencement day by the president of Vassar College or Antioch College or blah, 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 blah. Just at this time, however, the catamenial function began to show signs of failure of power. No severe or even moderate illness overtook her. She was subjected to no unusual strain. She was only following the regimen of continued and sustained work, regardless of nature's periodical demands for a portion of her time and force, when, without any apparent cause, the failure of power was manifested by diminished excretion. Essentially, it started to stop. Her period started to not come. So what this is saying is that he's arguing here that women cannot work when they are having their period. At least not at the same continued level, right? That essentially she should have stopped that continuous hard work while she was having her monthly function or period, right? She was only following the regimen of continued and sustained work regardless of nature's periodical demands, right? So right here, it's very much saying that if you continue a regimen of continued and sustained work while you're having your period, that's problematic, because then you lose your period. Soon after this, the function ceased altogether, and up to this present writing, a period of 6 or 8 years, it has shown no more signs of activity than an amputated arm. In the course of a year or so after the cessation of the function, her head began to trouble her. First there was a headache, then a frequent congested condition, which she described as a rush of blood to her head, and by vagaries and forebodings and despondent feelings began to crop out. With this mental state, her skin became rough and coarse, and acne covered her face. She retained her appetite, ability to exercise and sleep. A careful local examination of the pelvic organs by an expert disclosed no lesion or displacement there, no ovaritis or other inflammation. Appropriate treatment, faithfully preserved in, was unsuccessful in recovering the lost function. I was finally obliged to consign her to an asylum. So again, she ends up getting put to an asylum because of whatever health issue she was actually having, which he connected to college education and working when you're having your period and everything like that. This was taken seriously. Why I wanted to make sure that this was right is because this shows this was a huge argument against women working in or being in college. And this was put up against women saying that this is why women should, this is too much for women, and that they needed to stop. And there, like I said, it was taken seriously. Now, women did push back, and argued that there were the benefits of college and had nothing to do with their work or the labor that they were having to do. Women actually, we'll put this under that one here, 9. Women wrote letters and published arguments against Dr. Clark. They claimed that any type of physical issue that they were having was not related to education, and gave examples of all the women that were successful and had no problems. They also said if there was any issues that were causing health issues, it was their clothing that was problematic. And said that one of the things is that we have to wear heavy dresses, and sometimes like the hoops and stuff, and undergarments. And these are restrictive to breathing. And also put tension on your organs. And so they said this was more likely to cause issues with women's health, because simply walking from class to class becomes an exercise and difficulty in itself because of what they sometimes have to wear. And then they also, like I said, gave example after example of college-educated women that had no problems. So that debate continued, along with like whether it was a coeducation or women's only school was better. But it was something serious of a pushback of trying to suggest that women shouldn't be educated in college. Now the other so as time went on, more and more women ended up being educated in with a college degree. And this is going to have significant impacts when we look at the progressive era. You had, the more traditional positions, ladies' courses and stuff like that. But you do have the development of what's basically the professional woman, right? That now you have these positions and purpose. Of course, there was also the question of like, what's the role for women if they're getting these degrees? How can they be used? Social work was a big one, and nursing. And those will have positions for women. Well, again, we'll see in the progressive era, especially both of those are going to be connected to what we see happen in the progressive era in the 1880s, and women directly using those. But you also had women pushing for other professions that were largely closed to women. Lawyer and doctor were some, and scientists as well. But lawyer and doctor, and some scientists too, but especially these two were definitely seen as controversial, because in the courtroom, the legal profession was very much the we'll start with the lawyer first. It was very much the male domain. The courtroom was seen as a male sphere, right? Because that went into legal aspects in the law. While women were allowed to be admitted to the bar, there were others that were denied. So Iowa did admit a woman to the bar in 1869. But it was very much a case-by-case basis. And the Supreme Court actually argued that when one woman sued because she wasn't allowed to take the bar, that it would destroy the courtroom, would destroy women's femininity. Let me rewrite that there. So they saw it as this very much of a male dominant place, and said that the delicacy of the female sex was unfit for many occupations in civil life. So while women could become lawyers, they couldn't practice. So they had a degree as a lawyer, but could not practice in the courtroom. This left some women without any kind of job. Many women that did continue a role in that position had worked in their family law firm, and basically were the legal aid over that position now, where they printed legal forms. They helped draft legal forms and office work, we'll say. I know there's a name for it. Paralegal? There we go. And so they were consigned to only that kind of working with lawyers and having a law degree, but not getting the official passing the bar to be able to practice law. Doctor also became medicine. Medicine became easier to get into, in part because women were accepted as nurses, but many women looked to expand that to doctor and being able to become a doctor. And so this was easier at first because there was no separate medical school. Medical schools began to develop in 1890, and then women were eventually admitted into there. But this was easier to connect to the domestic sphere. And more importantly, there was an argument that women doctors were important because they could then treat women and children. Of course, they were not going to treat men. So this was easier, first because there wasn't a separate medical school, and then because it could be connected to the domestic sphere. So what's significant about all of this, though, is that as more and more women become educated, you are there's a huge push and transition for an increase in women's jobs and roles within society, and creating a profession for women. And so you have a huge jump in kind of jobs where you could be professors, principals, presidents of all women's schools, lawyers, doctors, working as librarians, and that women are going to use this to expand their roles, as well as we'll see be super active in society during the Progressive Era in many, many ways. And this can get all the way connected to really the 1920s, and where you have a significant shift in the role of women with the flappers and that era. Okay, so in the North, right, those were things when pushing for women's suffrage, and then an increase in education. In the South, you have a very different experience, because of course it's mostly focused on preventing Black freedom. So with the South and Reconstruction, one of the things that immediately happens after the Civil War is that you have an immediate push for an expression of freedom. I was going to say in meeting, but that's part of it. The expression of freedom for Black men and women. We'll say Black Southerners. Right? With the 13th Amendment, slavery is outlawed, and there's a transition period. So there's going to be the official Reconstruction period, but right after the Civil War, it was a transition period, and Reconstruction wasn't solidified, and Andrew Johnson hasn't come in and kind of destroyed everything. And so what you get in this early period is one of mass movement. Women and men were not allowed to leave the plantations. So now that there was a freedom of movement, essentially what we'll see is the expression of freedom was anything that they couldn't do under slavery, they were doing. One was looking for family members. Women actively went out searching for their children and husbands that had been sold during slavery. Another was just the ability to move. Many people, including women, moved every couple of months just to prove they could still do it. And that became a significant sign of freedom in that sense. You do have a move out of jobs. For women, we'll put this as jobs and family because it usually was tied to that. One of the things that happens right off the bat is that women move out of plantation work. Right? They don't want to work in the fields, and even men kind of moved away from that. But even the domestic household work, women largely initially avoided until, of course, during Reconstruction, this is going to become kind of the only thing they can do. This coincided with marriage, the fact that they could officially get married. Many women and men got married. This included expressions of freedom of getting a wedding dress, wearing a hat, clothing and things like that they couldn't do before. And so maybe not directly connected to marriage, but it was where it was shown, right? Wearing nice clothing, a wedding dress, and hats. These things had not been available to them before. Being able to raise the children. So one of the consequences of this was this idea of traditional family roles. In the slave quarters, women, it was not a fully matriarchal society, but women had a lot of power and control, because not only were they producing the same in the fields, but then they were taking care of everything and the slave quarters, the children, cooking, doing all that stuff. And it gave women a lot of agency within the slave community. Obviously not outside of that, because they were slaves. But within that community and part of the family, it was much more equal. There's arguments for it being matriarchal, but it was definitely at least equal. They had a lot more equal status within their own specific family units. And after getting out of slavery, there was a huge push to move to more traditional roles where women did not work and took care of the kids and raised the kids. And this is completely understandable, as a desire to not have their wives go work for white people that were going to abuse them and potentially rape them and put them into conditions that were difficult. They wanted to provide for them and be able to do those things that were not allowed. However, long term, what it does create is it then puts women in kind of the same position as white women, to where they become under femme covert and under that same kind of patriarchal structure. So it did have a negative long-term aspect of just you lose the equality that women had within their internal family units. Obviously there's other freedoms, and not being a slave is a huge part of that, but you do see that shift take place. But this still was seen as expressing freedom, because they were not allowed to do that. You could not, as a woman, not work and just raise your kids as a slave. So that part was an important part of expressing freedom. And it's completely understandable why that's what they push for, because that had not been allowed before. Besides that, education and churches became a big thing, right? These were both denied to them, and so both men and women actively sought out education for not only themselves, but for their children. And this was so important that communities free black communities willingly taxed themselves so that they could build a school and pay for teachers. And because there was very much an understanding that education was part of that pathway to maintaining and keeping freedom, and also potentially better jobs and other things like that. And so this was extremely valued and seen as important for both men and women. And then churches provided community and often were part of early political leaders. Of course, pastors were still men, but it provided a community for women to attend, to talk, to kind of have this safe place. And then just any other kind of expression of freedom that took place that they were not allowed to do. Owning guns and weapons, dogs, alcohol, anything that, right, these were all things that were not allowed in slavery. And both men and women actively went around expressing these things because they were important. Now, why does this change, right? There was a lot of openness and freedom early on, and with, of course, the 14th and 15th Amendment, men were able to vote and be part of politics at the very beginning. All of this is going to go away. Well, why this changes is because of Andrew Johnson. When Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson was the vice president. And there wasn't a fully cohesive Reconstruction plan in place yet. And he was actually the only Southerner not to leave for the Confederate for the Confederacy. He was he wasn't poor, but he definitely was. He always wanted to be part of the elite South and was not. And so when Reconstruction first started, he claimed he was going to be harsh, or maybe strict, if with the word, on the South. And perhaps, it was kind of seen as this moment to punish the plantation elite for not being part of that crowd. And here's the thing: when you had journalists that went and interviewed people in the South, and because of the devastation of the Civil War, people were just done, and they said, we're willing to acquiesce to whatever it takes to get back in the Union, we'll do. If they want us, voting rights, equality, blah blah blah, whatever, we'll do it. After Andrew Johnson had been president for a while, they went back and interviewed people in the South again, and the tone had significantly changed to basically, screw you. We're going to do what we want. Southern state rights. And why this happened was in part because of Andrew Johnson's policies that he didn't follow through on. So he claimed, right, that he was going to be strict and there was going to be harsh, right, punishments to the South. And in part because it was saying, right, that they, some would be basically accused of treason. There would be disenfranchisement for certain parts of for certain Southerners. And then, right, so this was specifically to who was not allowed to vote, was the wealthy plantation elite and officers in the Confederate Army. Right, and that's what Susan B. Anthony had been charged with, was this law here. And it started out that way. And then a loss of property. So that property would be taken from the plantation owners and given to some free black, some of it to the free black population and others to poor white Southerners. And that while some of that could be restored and stuff like that, that it was going to be minimal. So what they had to do is that in order to, here, let's put it here, restore states' rights, they had to show that they were following the new laws, of course. They also had to pledge loyalty to the U.S. And then he said that individuals they had to get individual pardons for these people that were had lost those rights. And so there was a total of 14 groups that were in the South that were excluded. Those were two of the biggest ones. So it wasn't just two. There was a total of 14 groups of people, of Southerners excluded. But that they would have to petition for individual presidential pardons. The South after kind of initially adopting this and following through, began to realize that Johnson wanted to be part of the club. And I think it came with the individual pardons when they started realizing that they could use flattery and inclusion to get him on their side. And so they started, so inclusion for Andrew Johnson, not for everyone else. Invite him to the parties, to be part of the group, the club, right? To get him on their side. Like this was connected. They figured out psychologically what he wanted. And so he started doing mass pardons. And also basically allowing the states to do what they wanted. And once this was realized and that the harsh punishments weren't going to come, they changed their tune and began, so you had this shift where they began to restrict Black freedom and rights, specifically with an attempt to how can we to restore it to a point as close to slavery as possible. They couldn't reinstitute slavery because of the 13th Amendment, but they were like, what can we do to limit rights and get it to as close of slavery as possible? And so you ended up with this whole defiance that took place. And where you start seeing this first emerge is in the Black Codes. So Andrew Johnson, one of the mistakes is people will write Andrew Johnson wrote the Black Codes. He did not write them. Each state created their own. Each southern state created their own Black Codes. The reason that they were allowed to happen for a while was because of Andrew Johnson, because he allowed it to happen. He didn't force, he brought in and basically said that the Union was restored way before he should have said that. And gave out the mass pardons and then said the Union is restored when the South had not followed and capitulated to all of the original things that they were supposed to do. And this happened because of the fact that they figured out that they could flatter him and include him, and he would capitulate to those plantation elite. Because clearly, even though he claimed he hated them because of growing up in his experiences, he more just wanted to always be a part of them. It seems to be the biggest thing. So each state created these, and the Black Codes, their entire goal was to, as close as possible, replicate the conditions of slavery and extremely limit Black freedom, as well as in the process of that, reinforcing white control and supremacy. So we're going to look at the Mississippi Black Codes. Again, each state had their own. So you read the Mississippi Black Codes, different states' Black Codes will be slightly different. However, this is a good example because while they were all technically slightly different, they had a lot of the same ideas. So if you read this one, you get a sense of what the Black Codes were like in most of the southern states. So I already highlighted some things just to make sure it was clear of pointing out as we're going through this. This is not all the Black Codes. This is also just an excerpt of the Black Codes. But I wanted to look at what it is that it's doing, and how this then limited freedoms and this applied to both men and women. There was no separation of rules only for the men, or for women. This was for everyone. So it's not lawful to intermarry with any white person, nor for any person to intermarry with any. That's the same language. It is not lawful to intermarry with any white person, and or the white person to intermarry with any black person, free or otherwise. Right? Well, they were all free at this point, but like always free, born free, or been free, right? So they didn't distinguish. It wasn't like a distinction of former slaves. No, any black person could not marry a white person. So one of the things with doing that, of making intermarriage illegal again, was to keep a separation of the races. That's the same reason that law came into place before. And then it's a felony, and put into jail for life if they do. Now, of course, why it says to intermarry with a white person, then it does say any person to intermarry with a black person. It was that both sides, there was punishments. Of course, consequences would have been harsher for the black person than the white person as far as that. But the idea of too that it's not just a fine or some jail or whatever. It's for life. Then the next thing they did is that you had to have a lawful home or employment and have written evidence of this. This was to limit job options. It was meant to limit the work, specifically trying to keep it to farm work or domestic work. And so they re-pigeonholed black labor for women into that domestic sphere. And then they expanded that. So not only did you have to have a contract of labor to show that you had a job, but if any laborer shall quit the service of the employer before the expiration of term of service without good cause, which of course wasn't just I got a better job, like someone offered more, or I didn't like working there. Like there wasn't much that they counted as good cause. He shall forfeit his wages for that year up to the time of quitting. Now it says he, but women, a good cause was to have children. So there was an out for women from this, which was being pregnant and having kids. If you didn't have that, though, then you didn't have a good cause as a woman either. And so you lose your wages for up to a year. And every civil officer shall, and every person may arrest and carry back to his or her legal employer anyone who quits the service of his or her employer before the expiration of his or her term of service without good cause. So, you not only lose your wages, but every civil officer and every person, so every white person, anyone, if you decide to leave your employment before the expiration date on the contract, you are forcibly taken back to that employer and made to work, and you lose your wages for a year. So that again, that was pigeonholing and making them be forced to work for former plantation owners or new plantation owners, but still keep them within that plantation system. Then you have the Vagrant Laws, and the Vagrant Laws are crazy because we're going to look at the long list that they come up with. Essentially, they tried to write an all-inclusive, all of these different ways we can charge you with vagrancy. And this way, if you're charged with vagrancy, then you can be fined or jailed or forced to go work somewhere that we put you. All rogues and vagabonds, idols, dissipated persons, beggars, jugglers, which is always an interesting one. As like jugglers means something else back then. Persons practicing unlawful games or plays. So, like, you can't be a juggler. If you're juggling, if you're practicing unlawful games or plays, runaways, common drunkards, common night walkers, which is prostitution, pilferers, lewd, wanton, or lascivious persons in speech or behavior, common railers and brawlers, persons who neglect their calling or employment, misspend what they earn, Right. So they can sit there and judge if you are being frivolous with your spending or does not provide for the support of themselves or their families or dependents. All other idle and disorderly persons, which again is super vague, including all who neglect all lawful business, habitually misspend their time by frequenting houses of ill fame, prostitution houses, gaming houses, or tippling shops, shall be deemed and considered vagrants under the provisions of this act. And they're fined $100. But most of the black population in the South that were former slaves didn't have the money to pay for that. And if they couldn't, then they could be imprisoned. So this whole thing is meant to be not just vague. Well, it's very specific, but all encompassing. So that for ridiculously small things, you can be called a vagrant and get charged with this law. And then it goes into additional things. Anyone over the age of 18 without lawful employment will be considered a vagrant. Unlawful assembling themselves together, so you can't hang out in large groups freely, day or night. Any white persons assembling together with them, you'll be deemed vagrants. So this was intended to prevent large groups. Not even large groups, prevent groups. And this was something that was a rule under slavery, that there could only be so many slaves together outside of the plantation. And this was an attempt to control who hung out with who. And also, again, separation of race, saying white people couldn't hang out with them. And that they will be fined, again, $50 for black men, $200 for white men, and can also be imprisoned. And then here, criminal offenses. This is also, all of these things are catch-alls. Like, so basically they're saying, if we don't like you, if we can, come up with anything, we can charge you with a crime, and then we can fine you, and we're putting a price on the fine we know you can't pay, and then we can either imprison you, or the other option besides imprisonment was to send them to work for someone to pay off for a year. And so you essentially were forced back into a termed slavery or indentured servitude for like anything and everything. So here are other offenses. That no freeman can carry a firearm, ammunition, dirk or bowie knife without being fined. You also, anyone committing riots, routs, affrays, trespassing, malicious mischief, cruel treatment to animals, but here, seditious speeches, insulting gestures, language, or acts. So if you gave someone the middle finger, then you were charged under this law as a black man or woman. But seditious speeches could also be vague enough to include almost anything. Language and gestures, like that like basically if you looked at a white person wrong, there was potential for you to be charged under this. And that was intentionally done to create a deference back to white people. So they felt that the free black population was getting too bold in their actions in that early period of expressions of freedom. And this was a way to challenge that. Also disturbing the peace, which is also pretty vague. You couldn't be a minister unless you had a license. Selling liquors or any other misdemeanor. And then that would be imprisoned, fined $100 or imprisoned. Or again, what it's not saying, because it says it later in a part that's not part of this excerpt, they can always replace imprisonment with work. And then any white person who shall sell, lend, or give a firearm, weapons, etc., can be fined as well. So they were actively trying to keep the separation of the races and prevent pretty much any type of expression of freedom. So if we look at like what those laws, right, you had the yearly labor contracts. And with that, it was in two parts, men to go in the fields. It was meant for women to be restricted to domestic or field work. And they still technically allowed them in field work too. Of course, almost no one wanted to work in the fields, and so it pigeonholed black women into this very domestic one of cook, cleaner, right, or the kind of the nanny of raising the kids. In the traditional, right, all of these were traditional slave roles for household slaves. And both were, right? Most women, though, if they were going to choose for women, their husbands and even them, they didn't want them going back into field work. You were more likely to be raped and assaulted in the field labor. Although, like I said, there still was a household too, but it was just more potential for physical violence, and field work was so connected to slavery. I mean, household slaves were too, but even more so field labor. And so it limited, it was intentionally meant to limit that as well as movement, right? Because you were stuck in contract and couldn't find a better job. That was intentional to limit movement as well as competition and better wages through competition. Because before they came up with these laws, some plantation owners were paying more to get more workers over into their area, and that was increasing wages, and they didn't want them to have more money, right? And so then besides that, right, the vagrant laws, and criminal laws were specific to, again, anything. This idea of being idle, of disorder, misspending money, being rude, right, insulting gestures, etc., right, what we just read. All of these things, and here we can, and then owning weapons, were all this, so that anything could be charged, right? So if a woman was walking down the street and she, and let's say a man talked to her rudely or said something, and you responded and told him to shove off, that would fall under this. And all of these things were then meant to have you go back to, all meant to show control and power of the white population over the black, and also to get free work, right? Because the punishment, as I mentioned, even though it's cut off in that excerpt, one of the punishments was 1 year of free labor, right? With no choice. You didn't get to choose. You didn't get to choose where you went. The other way you see this forced labor was in orphan laws. So you did have a lot of children that were orphans, either just by not being able to find their relatives, or the fact that their parents had been killed or died. And so if relatives couldn't be found, the court could determine where to place them. And the number one place that they placed them was at a plantation, both boys and girls, for labor. So not to be raised as a child, as a kid, until 21. And many times women tried to get custody of children they knew, even if they weren't biologically their own kids, sometimes that they knew and had been raising at the plantations, and the courts almost always rejected it. So they're saying, we have a place for this kid. We can take this kid in. I know him. I raised him on the plantation. I knew his mother. Like, we can provide a home. And they rejected it because what they wanted was free plantation labor. And so this is what was done to limit the freedom and put men and women back into that condition. Now, these eventually were found unconstitutional. Sorry, scrolling through really fast. So eventually these were deemed unconstitutional. But by then, you have reinstituted a level of control in the South that is going to continue to limit freedoms. And that's going to, once they're deemed unconstitutional, it's going to shift to the segregated South. So the new aspect is going to be segregation. Fine, we can't do the black codes, then we'll create segregation to keep this separate and unfair systems and resources available to people. And so that's why, this is why it ultimately, oops, always moves when I bump it. This is why it shifted to segregated South. Okay, the last thing I want to look at for Reconstruction is that once Andrew Johnson kind of, officially gave them the go-ahead, the South became very, very defiant and resistant to any type of change. The North had, and initially during the first part of Reconstruction, the North was in charge of the local governments, and you had black politicians, black men could vote. And as they slowly tried to shift towards reintegration, if you will, of the southern states, they constantly had to push back against what were called redeemers and the Klan, the KKK. And so much so that they had multiple laws that were created against them and creating them as a terrorist group, essentially, and keep sending in the military until finally Grant was like, who became president, I'm tired of this crap. They can deal with it themselves, and kind of just gave up. And that really ultimately is Reconstruction was a failure. It didn't work. And it didn't, bring back the South into the Union where they respected the laws and followed the rules, and instead narrowly tried to define those to specifically limit freedoms. So the Redeemers saw themselves as what they called as redeeming the greatness of Southern ways. It was all about that idea of restoring Southern pride and culture, right? That was claimed that had been lost with the loss of the Civil War, and so they were redeeming the South. Now, the Klan developed at first as a Tennessee social club. And this was in 1866. And it was intentionally, they called it a social club, but it was for a very specific purpose, which was not social or nice in any way. Social clubs sound so benign. It was an instrument of terror. And we're going to look at this more. Well, actually, it won't be with the Klan, though, because it won't be needed. The Klan was needed because of the Republicans in charge in the government, and then later the penalties for what they were doing, preventing voting and all those type of things. So they wore the masks to hide who they were. They had to hide their identities. The whole point of the Klan was to invoke terror. And then the whole point of like the robes and the hoods was to hide their identities. When you get to the segregated South, the Klan wasn't needed anymore because you were able to lynch someone in public in the most violent way, and there were no repercussions. In fact, they took photos and put them on postcards and sent it, and there were no repercussions. So the Klan didn't become necessary because essentially the South became the Klan, and you didn't have to hide your identity. The Tennessee Social Club became the KKK, and again, it was used to create terror, but they had to hide their identities at the beginning of Reconstruction. That was the reason for it. And it's why then the Klan kind of declines, is because, one, there was a huge federal push against claiming Klan members as terrorists, and then they also didn't have to hide their identity anymore. So that's kind of like, so why, and then we'll see it reemerge. It reemerges in the 1920s. But the instrument of terror was about solidifying white control and power through terror, right? It was about limiting Black freedom, and in a specific way with that, preventing Black voters, right? Because then if they had, if they prevented Black voters, then they could control white people, the Redeemers, could control the Southern government. And of course they do, which is why you get segregated South. So what they did is that they would show up in their outfits at voting booths and intimidate people. They threatened people. They attacked. Both women were not immune from being attacked by the Klan. Their people's homes were burning crosses were put up in homes. They threw bricks. They physically pulled men and women out of their homes and beat them. Any white person who supported Black freedom was also targeted. And like I said, they didn't discriminate between men and women as far as the physical violence. And they killed both Black men and women who especially pushed back. So there, any person who tried to stand up for rights, anyone who pushed back, they did not only threaten and abuse, but also killed individuals as well. Their initial target, though, like I said, was the voting box. So they started with that to make sure that if they could prevent Black voters, then they could get those politicians out of office. They also threatened and targeted politicians, Black politicians, to get them to not run again or step down. So all of that could be replaced with those who were seen as Redeemers or Southern Democrats, who supported not only originally the Black codes, but then Reconstruction and those laws of or not supported Reconstruction, supported the laws of segregation. But then it expanded out to targeting men and women that in any way basically didn't follow the Black codes, even if they were there. You gave someone a inappropriate look. You acted too important as they saw it. If you acted like you were better than your place in Southern society, that could get you on the list. And that was all about that sense of terror and violence and murder in order to accomplish that goal. And that, ultimately worked because as much as at the federal level they attempted to push back, it only, the problem was as soon as this Grant decided not to continue creating laws and arresting those groups, it became a huge issue. And again, initially Grant did arrest them. He labeled them as a sponsored terrorist group, but there was enough pushback over and over again that it ultimately became this thing where he saw it wasn't worth continuing. And so that's where we're going to leave it. So that's where we're stopping. We're going to pick right back up in the next lecture with a segregated South, and how with the end of Reconstruction, how the end of Reconstruction is that the Redeemers get into the government, and then all hope of kind of creating that more equal sense of laws disappears. And instead, what you get is the segregated South. So that's where we'll end. Like I said, pick right back up in the next lecture.